So what is it that's wrong with what Mr. Peterson has to say about Marxism? Well, it's partly that he's recycling old Cold War stuff. The Cold War was over in 1989. Most of us have moved on around the world. Mr. Peterson seems to be stuck.
It is true that the Cold War ended in 1989. It's also true that many of the most important and damning documents showing what communists did, how they did it, and why, only became declassified and available to the public after 1989. During the Cold War, it was very difficult for anyone to know what lies were made up by the CIA, what lies were made up by the Soviet Union, what was information and what was disinformation. Many people who were themselves harsh critics of communism during the Cold War were astounded to discover, only after the Cold War was over, that as terrible as they thought communism had been, the reality was much, much worse. This happened partly due to archives that were declassified in the Soviet Union, and in Communist China has continued to be communist, piece by piece, archival evidence and just research from the inside was sort of smuggled out, published one way or another, very often by people who themselves have been long-standing members of the Communist Party, but had become disillusioned with it. So, yes, the Cold War is over, but the level of secrecy and disinformation means that in the year 1989, it was very difficult for anyone to know with certainty the types of things I now know. Let me ask you a question, Professor. Which side did the United States fight on in Cambodia? And why? The United States of America, even under President Ronald Reagan, fought on the pro-communist side, supporting Pol Pot. Many people refer to that as a secret. It's not really secret, but it's something very few people knew. In 1989, the American bombing of Laos, a communist country, was likewise referred to as the Secret War. What exactly happened, even if you're just looking at atrocities committed by the United States of America, a country that did have freedom of speech and still does, was very difficult to unravel. Finding out what happened under Mao Zedong in China during the worst periods of mass murder and mass starvation, finding out what really happened under Lenin and Stalin, those things have gotten easier since 1989, of course, partly due to the internet, but partly also due to changing political conditions. So now, as never before, it's possible to know. It's possible to learn the lessons of that history for the first time, and that's why the whole world is changing, and that's why the whole world is laughing and jeering at you Marxists like never before.
And he's stuck with one of the oldest kinds of arguments imaginable, telling us that we should not be interested in Marxism. In fact, it's kind of immoral, in his words, to be interested in Marxism in view of what Stalin did in Soviet Russia. Well, okay, Stalin did terrible things in Soviet Russia. However, Marxism exists in every country on the face of the earth. It's been going on for 150 years, and a lot more than what happened in Russia under Stalin over a period of 15 or 20 years has to be taken into account if you're going to make an assessment of Marxism. To use the one example that is really horrible over there as the judgment on Marxism would be about the same sense as saying Christianity should be dismissed because of the Catholic Inquisition or the destruction of the Native American population by Christians, or the Holocaust against Jews, gays, and so forth by Christians in Germany, and on and on and on.
I'm not going to laugh, but I'm tempted to respond to this satirically. Of course, the Catholic Church is discredited because of what happened in the Inquisition. Of course. And of course, it would be immoral for anyone today, to make excuses for, justify, or glorify those crimes carried out by the Catholic Church. Of course, both the Catholic and Protestant churches of various European countries, but notably the Anglican Church of England, were engaged in genocidal campaigns against Native Americans, First Nations, Indigenous people, whatever term you want to use. And it would be deeply disturbing and indeed evil for people to say positive things in support of those atrocities, in support of attempted genocide and actual genocide today. Now, you claim that Marxism is much larger and much broader than merely what happened under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. You say it exists in countries all around the world. Those are precisely the people who made excuses for Joseph Stalin and who still make excuses for Joseph Stalin to this day. Those are the people who are very much equivalent to Nazi Holocaust deniers, or to people who would still very positively assert that there was something good or right or justifiable about the crimes of genocide carried out by the Catholic Church, in some cases by the Protestant Church, by European Christian churches in the colonization of North America and South America, the so-called New World. You say this as if it were preposterous for someone like me to strongly morally oppose and condemn the Christian Church for its atrocities in the past. You say this as if it would be absurd for people today to hold those institutions, those political organizations, legally and morally accountable for the crimes they committed in the past, and to regard them as stained and discredited by the crimes they committed in the past. There's nothing absurd about that at all. In the same way that I regard the Nazi Party as discredited by the crimes committed by the Nazis, by what the real world consequences of their ideology was. Of course, I regard Christian churches, plural, as discredited by the historical record of Christianity. Don't you? And if not, why not? Moreover, there is a question in each of these instances of how clear a line can be drawn from precept to practice. How clear a line can be drawn from what's preached in principle by these parties, what's set down in their manifestos, and what happened when those principles were put into practice. The relationship between atrocities committed by Christopher Columbus and Spanish imperialism is very direct. The relationship between Spanish imperialism and the papal authority of the Catholic Church in Rome is very direct, and the Pope directly made judgments on questions about the legalization of slavery, which forms of slavery were legal and which were illegal, questions of genocide, questions of what were then human rights, about whether or not indigenous people of South America would be recognized as human and as descendants of Adam on this earth, and so on. The political vocabulary was very different. It was much more medieval. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church was very directly involved ideologically and, in a sense, in making policy in shaping the Spanish Empire in South America. The Catholic Church literally drew the border between Brazil and the rest of South America, which was at that time the border between the area that was going to be colonized by the Portuguese and the area that was colonized by the Spanish. They made fateful decisions that had devastating impacts on indigenous people in that continent. Why would they not be responsible? Why would we not judge the Catholic Church by what it had done in principle and practice? And why would we not describe someone as evil who today is a member of a neo-Nazi party, or today is a member of a Catholic revivalist party, or what have you? Someone who really claims that these things are justifiable, morally right and good.
2 world wars by capitalist Christian countries fighting each other might all qualify for the kinds of argument Mr. Peterson makes. We don't make those kinds of arguments because they make no sense, and Mr. Peterson oughtn't to do that with Marxism.
What remains implicit and unstated here is the conceit that somehow Marxism does not contain principles that directly condone and call for violence. And that is false. That is a lie. The distinctive, definitive doctrines of Marxism include class war. And people say this phrase so often that it starts to lose its meaning. Class war is violence of a most terrible kind. And you really should take the time to read some examples of what class war means in practice, of people going from door to door, house to house in their neighborhood, and murdering their so-called class enemies in their sleep, of the Soviet army going from town to town and stealing farmers' horses and chickens and pigs, and murdering farmers, deciding which of various poverty-stricken farmers qualify as middle class as opposed to absolutely poverty-stricken. Even within China, the Communist Party deciding which tribal groups in rural Yunnan had achieved bourgeois status and which were so poor, so backward, still living in Stone Age conditions, that they would be exempt from this type of class analysis, following the instructions of Karl Marx, the letter and the spirit of exactly what Karl Marx said about the development of society through a series of stages, and that some societies are so primitive that they have no middle class, have no landlords, etc. The violence of Marxism is not some kind of corruption or aberration that crept into Marxism. It's something that's written out very clearly in Karl Marx's work, like the Communist Manifesto. It's something that's written down very clearly in principle in the works of all these major leaders, not just Stalin, Karl Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong. It's not incidental. It's not accidental. And it is true that you have a difficult time drawing a straight line from a text like the Gospel of Mark, the New Testament, quotations from Jesus about the meaning of life. You have a difficult time drawing a straight line from that to atrocities committed in Nazi Germany. However, if you actually start to fill in the blanks, you'll realize there are other figures like Martin Luther, there are other stages along the way, and the line starts to get stronger and stronger. You start to understand how institutionally, culturally, even juridically, legally, there were practices that grew out of Christianity, and where the connection becomes stronger and clearer to how fascism and anti-Semitism developed in Germany at that time. Again, Martin Luther being a major intellectual source in the Reformation of Christianity, in Germany especially, and the single most influential author on anti-Semitism of his millennium, I suppose. I think it would be really phony and insincere to say that there's a single word in the American Constitution that justifies or makes inevitable atrocities committed by Americans in Vietnam. And they did commit atrocities. The Americans also committed atrocities in South Korea in the Korean War. But there is no principle you're going to find in the U.S. Constitution. There's no principle in the canon of capitalism that explains that so simply and directly as Karl Marx's principle of class war. Karl Marx's principle is that the progress of history can be achieved through violence, and through extreme violence only, of one social class rising up and destroying another. That's a very clear, very direct doctrine that defines Marxism as different from all forms of leftism, left-wing activism, whatever you'd like to call it. Marxists, historically, who have existed all over the world, took up the position that you should not try to incrementally improve capitalism, that you should not try to reform capitalism, that you should not try to help the workers by giving them higher wages, better benefits, by having unions make deals that would improve their lives through minimum wage reforms. They would not support what Bernie Sanders is now doing. Marxists, by definition, preached the inevitable progress of history through what's called materialist dialectics, a frankly crazy theory that the only way societies make progress is by exacerbating social class distinctions, exacerbating inequality, fomenting, creating, and encouraging hatred between social classes until one social class rises up to tear down the other. That's textbook Marxism. That's Karl Marx's major contribution to the intellectual development of politics in Europe. It's very clearly and very explicitly the embrace of extreme violence. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they were the two guys who read the history of the French Revolution. I'm here talking about the first French Revolution. They read the history of the French Revolution and said, it's not violent enough. It's not extreme enough. They didn't go far enough. They didn't chop off enough heads of enough aristocrats. They should have taken this further. They were the ones who said it was wrong to try to take a step backwards and create a democratic parliament and be moderate and try to have gradual process. Their analysis of the French Revolution was that it needed to go further, faster, and have more mass murder. Yes, I'm simplifying, but these are major elements, and these are two men who obsessed over the details of the history of the French Revolution. And their analysis of their own time in Germany, France, and England, their analysis was that it was completely fruitless to bring about the types of social democratic change that really did improve life in those countries for factory workers, for the poor, etc. They just wanted a violent revolution. That's who they were, and that's what their philosophy represented. And the vast majority of people in the mainstream left looked at the legacy of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels during their lifetimes and immediately after their death and said, no thanks. Our society has problems, and we can try to solve them by making ameliorative, positive change, by helping people working cooperatively, not by fomenting a violent revolution and trying to tear the system down and trying to vindicate dictatorship as something better than democracy when it merely clothes itself in the name, the dictatorship of the proletariat.